everybody. Today we are going to go over the as-is contract. You want to make sure that you are reviewing or filling out the most latest as-is contract. Now, most programs, Form Simplicity, Transaction Desk, Paperless Pipeline, Loop, all have the newest one in there. But by chance you download a document and you're not quite sure, down at the very bottom left, it'll say as is 6. Revision date was October of 2021. That is the latest revision of this contract. So the as-is contract is going to be between the buyer and the seller. Now, either one of these names could be in their legal name, a trust name, or an LLC. Now, one of the things that I do want to point out, when it becomes a trust or an LLC, it is important for you guys to do a little bit a step further by going into the tax records and looking to see if the authoritative people can actually be the ones that are signing it. So are they, do they have the authority to sign a document on behalf of the LLC? Or if the property is in a trust, do they have the authority to sign as the trustee for that trust property? Now, usually the deeds will have this information. So if you go to the tax records, you pull up the deed, it'll tell you who has the authority to sign. In an LLC, same thing. You may want to go to sunbiz.org to look up the LLCs as well, because it'll be able to, the articles of incorporation will be able to tell you who those signers are. So here it says this street address is zip and city, which is 123 Main Street, Unit 1504, Pompano Beach, Florida 33060. Highlighted here because you do not want to forget the unit number if you're filling it out for a condo or a townhouse that has a different unit number. Located in the county that the property is located in. So here we've got Broward. We also have the folio tax ID number, could also be considered the folio number, and the folio number is here as well. Real property, the legal description is, in some cases you can be able to get away with doing a shorthand. In most cases you can. The tax records has a shorthand that you can just auto-populate in there. However, if you want to go one step further, you can create an exhibit and copy and paste the full legal description, which is usually a pretty long description that you can put in there. And an Exhibit A is pretty much just a Word document that type up Exhibit A at the top, copy and paste the language for the legal description in there, and you can attach that to the contract if you want to put the full legal description to the as-is. It says here, together with all existing improvements and fixtures, including built-in appliances, built-in furnishings, and attached wall-to-wall carpeting and flooring, unless specifically excluded in paragraph 1E, which is down here, or by other terms of this contract. So right now we're going to talk about what's included in this contract. Personal property, unless excluded in paragraph 1E, or by other terms of this contract, the following items which are owned by the seller and existing on the property as of the date of the initial offer are included in the purchase. So here we go into the range: the refrigerator, the dishwasher, disposal, ceiling fans, light fixtures, drapery rods, and draperies, blinds, window treatments, smoke detectors, garage door openers, thermostats, and also like doorbells, like Ring doorbells, etc. Television wall mounts and television mounting hardware. You want to make sure you're having a conversation with the listing agent, or if you are the listing agent, to make sure you're having a conversation with the seller that if they do have TVs that are on the walls, for example, that they're going to have to know that those wall mounts or television mounting hardware is going to stay unless you exclude it from the contract. Also, security gates and other access devices, mailbox keys, and storm shutters, protection items, and hardware. So as you can see, what is included per the contract in here. What's not included in here is a washer and dryer. So you want to make sure that if that item is actually going to be excluded or included, that you put it in one of these sections here. So for example, if you have the washer and dryer that you want to make sure that it's coming along with the property, you want to make sure that you put Bosch washer and dryer or LG washer and dryer, make sure that that is actually coming along with the property as well. Microwave is another one that's not included up here too. So a lot of times you'll see a built-in microwave that's part of the aesthetics of the kitchen. Well, if you don't put that there, that seller could have the right to actually take that. So everything that is not included here that the buyer actually wants, make sure you're putting it in the inclusion. If it is a longer list than what these two lines offer, then you could do, again, another exhibit or a furniture list and add those remaining items that are going to be included in the purchase. So the section down below here, just below all this, talks about personal property, which is all of this, is included in the purchase price and has no contributory value and should be left for the buyer. Now it says the following items are excluded from the purchase. So if you're wanting to exclude any one of these items that are actually on the property at the time of making the offer, the seller wants to take the window treatments, then you need to make sure that you are excluding them in this section here. Now we're going to go into purchase price and closing fees. So if you are presenting an offer, your purchase price, you want to make sure that you're making your offer amount here. Your initial deposit is to be held in escrow in the amount of, so whatever you're going to make your initial escrow deposit for is going to be, in this case, we're going to go $595,000 for our offer, $15,000 for our initial escrow deposit. And now one of these boxes have to be checked. Either this $15,000 is going to accompany the offer, or it's going to be made within X amount of days. So if you have selected a company's offer, that means the title company already has those funds in their account. 99.9% of the time, you don't even have those funds yet. So in order to protect the buyer, you want to make sure they have a little bit of a leeway to be able to wire the funds or deposit the funds into the escrow account. So we're going to check this box here, section 2, that it's going to be made within 3 days after the effective date. It's already built into the contract. It doesn't need to be filled out here. However, I recommend every single line be filled out with either something here or either an NA, not applicable for whatever you're putting in. Okay, so it says escrow agent. This section right here is only for escrow. This is not who's actually going to be doing the closing of the property. So for example, if your property is in Palm Beach and seller chooses the title company, that's fine, but you can't put to be determined on this contract. By law, the contract has to have a title company, a real estate company, or a lawyer's office that holds escrow has to be put on here at the time of offer to let all parties know where the escrow is going to be held. Okay, so you can put the closing team here. The closing team would love your business. So you can put the closing team, the address, the phone number, the email address as well. So if you call in, if you don't really know much about the closing team and what they have to offer, I would definitely recommend calling in, having a conversation with them. They are amazing, and they will be able to make sure that your file gets closed in a timely manner. They're also in the office. They share a wall with me, so if there's any issues or anything like that, it's escalated, and I can come over and walk and make sure that your files are taken care of immediately. So on top of that, now we've got our initial deposit. We're showing where we're going to put that deposit. Are we going to be making a second deposit for escrow? Well, that's up to you guys on what you want to negotiate. So you don't have to do a second deposit. But if you do, I highly recommend that if you put a second deposit amount, you put this date that you're going to put it for the day following the inspection period. So if you have a 10-day inspection period, then you don't want to put 10 days here. If you're in the middle of negotiations and your buyer's like, oh, I'm on the fence, I don't know, I might want to back out of this deal, I'm not sure, I don't want to put the escrow in because I might at 11:59 p.m. be backing out of this deal, and all of a sudden you're writing up a release and cancellation, and you got to be worry about the buyer placing their escrow in time, and the buyer decides that they're going to go forward. Well, all of a sudden they didn't make their escrow payment. It's just a little bit of a headache. So in order to alleviate that headache, just put the second escrow payment for the day following the end of the inspection period. Okay. Financing. You can express this in either a dollar amount or a percentage. Me personally, I like to do it in a percentage because I just put 80%. And the systems will do the calculations for you, so you don't even have to do the math for what 80% is. But either way, you could do both. It's up to you and how you would like to handle that. Now, all of this will add up. So you have your offer amount of $595,000, less the $15,000 deposit, less the $50,000 deposit, less the 80% that the lender is going to provide, will give you a balance to close out of all of this here. This all must add up. And what it states here is that this amount of $54,000 does not include the buyer's closing costs, any prepaids, or any prorations for taxes or anything like that. So it'll be done by a wire transfer. So there are a lot of times where buyers will look at this and be like, oh great, I only have to put $54,000 down. I don't need to come up with anything else. I would have a conversation with the buyer stating this is, just the amount that you have to bring, less the purchase price. There's going to be additional fees that you're going to incur. Talk to your lender. We need to talk to a title company to find out what those fees are, so that you are aware of what you are going to be expected to bring to the closing table. Time for acceptance and offer and counter offers, and what is going to be the effective date. Okay, so now we're going to present an offer, and it says, if not signed by buyer and seller and an executed copy delivered to all parties on or before, we're going to put a date in there. So if we present an offer and we're going to give them 2 days to present the offer and get an offer back. If you do not receive an answer by 11:59 p.m. February 7th, your offer is deemed withdrawn, and the deposit, if there was any in escrow, will be returned to the buyer. Okay. If on February 8th you're still trying to get an answer back from the listing agent and the seller to find out if your offer has been accepted, they do not have to answer you on an offer because your offer is withdrawn. You need to go back, change the front page of the contract to say February 8th, February 9th, to give the seller more time to answer your offer so that it's still in the running. Now, let's go one step back here. If you presented an offer and you give them till February 7th, let's just say today's the 5th because I forgot to change this to go forward. But all right, so today's the 5th and you get a counter offer on the 6th. That means this date, the counter offers shall be within 2 days after the date the counter offer is delivered. So automatically the time for acceptance date, or the time for acceptance date is going to be extended 2 days. That doesn't mean that if the seller counters you back that the buyer really has 2 days. They should be presenting that counter back, which gives another 2 days and another 2 days, so that you understand what that time for acceptance date is. But make sure that you are doing it in a very timely manner where there's really not that much time in between those counters, because another buyer can come in, present an offer to the seller, and they might just take that offer while you're still in the works of negotiations between your counters back and forth. So it is very important, very vital, that you are countering back and forth immediately so that there is no timing issues for knowing how far this date's going to get pushed out because of the counteroffers. The effective date of this contract shall be the date when the last one of the buyer and seller has signed or initialed and delivered this offer or final counter offer. So again, if you are taking this one contract and you are going back and forth with the seller and you're changing the time frames on certain things, or the purchase price back and forth, I highly recommend that even on the initials that you put on these contracts for counter offers, there's dates beside them. Because the last person that signs is going to be the actual effective date of that contract. If you don't have initials, dates beside those initials, sometimes it can be construed as maybe that initial happened after or forward. So if you are going through an escrow dispute or some kind of contractual dispute and attorneys get involved, they need to know when those initials were actually placed. Dotloop is my favorite program for this because it actually does that for you and you actually see it on the contract. Form Simplicity and Transaction Desk, they're great programs, but they don't actually put the dates beside the initials. You can see them on the COAs that you get with them, showing them time stamped. But I mean, why not just have it on the actual document in itself? It just makes it so much easier. So effective date. In order for the effective date, your seller or your buyer, whoever countered last, may have the last initial. But if you do not get it back to the other party in a timely manner, then that is not an effective contract. So if you say my buyer initialed it and on this date, but I didn't get it back to that person, to the seller 2 days later, then that's the effective date is 2 days later. But within those 2 days, another buyer could come in and, scoop up that property. So again, timing is everything. Make sure that you are doing everything efficiently and make sure you're dating everything so that there's no discrepancies on who did what, when. Okay, so closing date. The closing of this contract shall occur when all funds required for closing are received by the closing agent, which is the title company, and collected pursuant to Standard S. So we'll go into that in a little bit. And all closing documents required to be furnished by each party pursuant to this contract are delivered. So unless modified by other provisions of this contract, the closing date shall occur on X date. So right now we have March 10th. Please do not put 45 days after effective date. That is really misleading on when that actual closing date will be. Why will that be misleading? Well, what if there's a discrepancy on who the last person actually really signed that, when that contract was actually delivered? You would have to go back and forth with all that data to figure out when that actually effective date was. So just put a hard date in there, March 10th, that's our hard date, that's the closing date. If anything needs to change, you're going to use an addendum to make sure both parties agree to it. Extension of closing. In the event closing funds from buyer's lender are not available on closing date due to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau closing disclosure. So in short, that's CFPB requirements. In paragraph 8B, which you'll see below, is the financing section of this contract. It says, if paragraph 8B is checked, then loan approval has been obtained and lender's underwriting is complete, then closing date shall be extended for such period necessary to satisfy CFPB requirements, provided such period shall not exceed 7 days. So it doesn't mean that buyer gets that full 7 days. So CFPB requirements means that the buyer has 3 days to be able to review the closing disclosure. In the event during those 3 days that maybe there's an interest rate change, they didn't lock in their interest rate, now there's a rate change or something like thereof, a new closing disclosure will need to go out. This contract allows for up to 2 closing disclosure changes. So when you add that up, you've got 3 days for one closing disclosure, a revision is changed. Now you have 3 more days for the new closing disclosure to go out, and then day 7 is actually the day of closing. In the old contract prior, we had 10 days, which allowed 3 closing disclosure revisions. This contract now only has 2. So when you are utilizing this clause here to say, all right, I'm implementing clause 5A, the buyer now has an extra couple days in order to be able to get the closing disclosure out, reviewed, and get ready to go to closing. You make sure that you implement it by sending an email stating that you are utilizing this clause to push out. But you're only going to have 3 days, so or 4 days really, for you have that day for closing. In the event that
You somehow hit mute on there. Hello, you're on mute.
my apologies, I was on mute. Was I on mute for the whole thing? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Let's start all over again. Did everybody hear me before?
Yes, you got muted after 5A.
Okay, all right, good. Let's go back to 5A. So 5A, you could hear me?
Yes.
Okay, let's go into 5B. My apologies, I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, 5B. In the event constituting force majeure causes services essential for closing to be unavailable. Force majeure are issues like hurricanes. So, including the unavailability of utilities or issuances like hazard, wind, flood, and homeowners insurance, closing date shall be extended as provided by Standard G. We'll go into Standard G in a few. We'll go over all the standards, but there's a time frame that in the event they can't go to closing, there's some time frames that the buyer is allotted. So occupancy and possession. So unless 6B is checked, which is down here, it says here that the seller shall, at closing, deliver occupancy and possession of the property to buyer free of tenants, occupants, and future tenancies. So if this box is not checked, you have no tenants in place, you have no pre-occupancy, you have no post-occupancy. That closing, that property is free and clear of everything. So highlighted here, it says at closing, seller shall have removed all personal items and trash from the property and shall deliver all keys, garage doors, openers, access devices, and codes if applicable to the buyer. Okay, so what does closing really mean? So they added in this contract all keys at the time of closing because homeowners or sellers would think that they don't have to provide the keys until they receive the funds into their bank account. Well, a closing really means, because the title company is the one that dictates when that closing is, that all paperwork has been signed, submitted to the title company, the lender has given their portion of the funds, the buyer has deposited their cash to closing, and when the title company has all of that, that means the property has now closed. When that happens, now the seller right here has been instructed that they need to provide the keys, the garage door openers, access devices, etc. So if you have a seller that says, I'm not going to provide you the keys until I receive my money, they're contractually obligated now to provide that at closing. If occupancy is delivered before closing, buyer assumes all risk of loss to the property from date of occupancy. So we should be responsible and liable for maintenance from that date, and she'll be accepted the property in the existing condition of that time. So So if the buyer moves in as a pre-occupancy to the closing, at the time they do that move-in, they're taking possession of that property. The AC goes out, you need a whole entire AC, that's now their responsibility. Pre-occupancies, I do not recommend, because they can have a lot of problems. You want to do pre-occupancy agreements, you want to have security deposits, but that's a whole nother ballgame that we can talk for hours about in a different segment. So, if by chance that there is a pre-occupancy, where the buyer is going to stay prior to, there is a rider that you need to attach to this contract, rider T, which is pre-closing occupancy by the buyer. So there's an addendum for that. Once that addendum is signed, the contract is signed, they're going to need to have a pre-occupancy agreement or lease done. Now, what happens if the buyer is going to purchase the property and there is actually going to be a tenant that's going to stay in there, or the seller is going to stay in the property after closing? So this is going to give us some time frames on when certain documentation needs to be provided. So let's dive in. If property is subject to a lease or leases, maybe it's a multifamily of 4 or less, or any occupancy agreements, including now seasonal and short-term vacation rentals, after closing, or it is intended to be rented or occupied by third parties beyond closing, the facts and terms thereof shall be disclosed in writing by seller to buyer, and copies of written leases shall be provided to buyer, all within 5 days after the effective date. So once this contract goes effective and there are tenants in place, then the seller needs to be able to provide written leases to that buyer so that they can be reviewed. Within that time frame, if the buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion that the leases or terms of the occupancy are not acceptable to the buyer actually is allowed to terminate this agreement and get their deposit back. So it's releasing the buyer and seller from further obligations under this contract. Also needs to be provided are estoppel letters, and seller affidavits shall be provided pursuant to Standard D. So Standard D has more time frames on when these need to be provided. So except that tenant estoppel letters shall not be required for seasonal or short-term rentals. So if they're seasonal or short-term, you don't need estoppel letters or anything like that for those. If property is intended to be occupied by the seller after closing, you need to have rider U attached to this contract. That is the post-closing occupancy by seller. Once that's signed, this contract becomes effective. You will again need to have a post-occupancy agreement or a lease in place because that seller now becomes a tenant. Assignability. So there are 3 ways that this contract allows and does not allow for assignability. The very first one is it says that you may assign and thereby be released from further liability under this contract. So if you have a seller that is selling a property and the buyer, which is usually an investor, comes over and says, I want to make an offer. However, I'm going to make this this contract assignable. So you fill out a regular as-is contract and it's going to have an assignability agreement. In the event, this is not going to be the end user or the end buyer for that property. At that time, when this contract goes effective between seller A, buyer B is now going to start marketing that property to try and get an end user or buyer C to purchase this property. So it's kind of like a simultaneous sale. However, buyer B is now going to be released from further liability, and the buyer C is going to assume all of the responsibilities and the liabilities of this contract. So you need to know that if this is what the buyer's intentions are, or make sure the seller's aware of what the buyer's intentions are before checking this off. This is a very important box on this contract, so you understand what's going to happen during the duration of this closing. This one here may assign but not be released from liability. This is usually where a buyer is going to put this property in their name. So it could be Bob Brown and Judy Smith is purchasing this property. However, they're getting ready to put a trust together or an LLC together in the process of creating it. If that's the case, then you can say may assign but not be released from liability. So the buyers can actually, purchase the property in a trust or an LLC, but they're not released from any liability. They still have obligations underneath this contract. Or 3, which is may not assign this contract, meaning that if they are an investor or they are planning on putting it in a trust, the seller is not obligated to make that happen. And if none of these boxes are checked, at that point it says the buyer may not assign this contract. This, if you've been a realtor for longer than 2021, this section here was now added because a lot of people were not selecting that box, so they added that in there to not be able to assign it. All right, on to the fun stuff, the financing section. I get so many questions in regards to this, and people get hung up on it. So let's really dive into this and what it really means. So 8A is a cash transaction with no financing contingency. This does not mean that the buyer cannot try to obtain financing. But if this is the case and the buyer says, well, I'm going to try to get some financing here, but I'll be willing to pay cash at the end if I can't get that financing, that's fine. But you need to make sure you put a provision in this contract to allow that buyer to get an appraiser to go out there, because the seller might be like, well, no, this is a cash transaction. I'm not going to allow an appraiser to come into my home. Make sure you put a provision in the additional terms that seller's allowing to have an appraiser go out there. Otherwise, you could be having some issues with the seller not wanting to perform on something they don't technically need to perform on. 8B is financing. So we got a whole lot in here that we're going to go through. So it says this contract is contingent upon a 30-day loan approval after effective date. So there's 2 sections now here that we're going to dive into. So 1, it's contingent upon the buyer obtaining approval for either a conventional, FHA, VA, or other type of financing. If the buyer's not sure what type of financing they're actually going to apply for, and they might want to apply for a conventional loan or they might want to get an FHA loan, check them both off and make sure they apply for both of those loans. In the event that the buyer tries to go for a conventional loan first and realizes that during the duration of this contract that FHA is actually better for them on this contract, the seller's not obligated to have to sign the FHA addendums, and there are a few addendums that they will have to sign. Not only just the FHA addendum to this contract, but the FHA mandatory clause and other addendum contracts, agreements at closing. So if you think by chance that buyer's going to go FHA, check them both off, make sure they apply for both loans, and then you'll be fine. And here it says check 1. Is that loan going to be a fixed? Is it going to be an adjustable arm? Is it going to be a fixed or an adjustable rate in the loan amount? So if they're not sure on what they're trying to apply for, you could select either fixed or adjustable rate. At an initial interest rate not to exceed. As our interest rates are going up, the buyer might be like, well, I'm not willing to pay more than 7% for a rate. Then you want to make sure that you put that amount in there. Otherwise, it's going to be a prevailing rate based on the buyer's credit worthiness. Okay, so now we're going to have a term of 30 years if it's a fixed rate, or a term of a 5-year arm, 10-year arm, whatever it is, you're going to be putting that kind of information in there. Section 2 here is now added into the financing contingency where it wasn't before this contract was revised. So buyer's mortgage broker or lender having received an appraisal or alternative valuation of the property satisfactory to the lender. If either is required by lender, which is sufficient to meet the terms required for lender to provide financing for buyer and proceed to closing, is called an appraisal. Okay, so now within the financing contingency is now an appraisal contingency. So you're going to see on this contract where there's actually an addendum for an appraisal to have an appraisal contingency. You actually really no longer need it because the appraisal is built into the financing contingency. So you have section 1 and 2. And in order for this to actually be a loan approval, 1 and 2 must be met. So in the event that the appraisal comes back during the appraisal or the financing period short, then that buyer has the option to be able to back out because it may not meet the lender's requirements, or they may not have enough money to bring to closing, or something like thereof. So they have the right during that time period to back out of this contract, and we're going to talk about that in the next step here. Okay, so buyers shall make application for financing within 5 days after the effective date. So this is the third part of this contract where the buyer could technically default. The first one is not making escrow on time, or not making it at all. Second one is within the inspection period. If they don't back out of that inspection period and they want to back out after, there could potentially be a default somewhere in there as well. This is the third part of the default, is for the financing, which is needing to be applied for within 5 days of the effective date. If they do not make that within that time period, they could be in default of this contract and be risking their deposit. Okay, so they must use good faith and diligent effort to obtain that loan approval. That's part of it, of meeting the financing and appraisal terms of paragraph 8B1 and 2. So within the loan approval period, thereafter, to close this contract, loan approval which requires buyer to sell other real property shall not be considered loan approval unless rider V is attached. That's the sale of buyer's home addendum. So if the buyer is presenting an offer on a property but still has to sell their property, they need to make sure that they have a contingency on the sale of their property addendum in there to protect them for loan approval. Buyer's failure to use good faith and diligent effort to obtain the loan approval during that loan approval period shall be considered a default. Now that you know that in order for a loan approval to be met with section 1 and section 2 with receiving the appraisal in there and time frame, you want to make sure you are not shortening this time frame any shorter than 20 days. It is very difficult for a lender. It can happen. I mean, it can definitely happen, but you want to make sure that the buyer has enough time to make application, that the lender has enough time to order the appraisal, that the appraiser has enough time to go to the home, do the actual work, get the report back, have the underwriter review that, and finally get it back stating whether it under appraised or it appraised. So if you are working on the buyer's behalf, you want to really seriously make sure you put that loan approval time frame as far out as you can get it, okay? That is very important, because if you don't, buyer's deposit can be at risk. So it says here, for purposes of this provision, what is diligent effort? That includes, but is not limited to, timely furnishing all documents and information required by buyer's mortgage broker and lender, and paying for appraisal and other fees and charges in connection. So if you have a buyer that says, well, I want to go through all the inspections first, and I have a 10-day inspection period, and I don't want to pay for that appraisal until I know that that inspection is going through, and on the 10th day, they still haven't done the appraisal, and you only have an appraisal financing contingency of 20 days, you know you're not going to have that appraisal met unless you have an amazing appraiser that's going to go out there and get that report back as soon as possible. So make sure that that is all timely done, and have a conversation with that buyer about these timelines so that they fully understand that there are defaults on this contract by not doing things in a timely manner. Buyers shall, upon written request, keep seller and broker fully informed about the statuses of buyer's mortgage loan approval, loan processing, appraisal, loan approval, including any property related conditions of the loan. So what is a written request? Well, a written request is an email. That's all it is. It's just an email. It can go back and forth. Emails are a legal form of communication. Text messages are not. Stop using text messages to go back and forth with buyers and sellers. or listing agents to get things buttoned up. Use email to make sure that you are protected and can provide that documentation to an attorney if they need to protect your customer. So if you are going back and forth on a text message, follow up in an email so that you guys are putting it on a legal form for written requests. So buyer authorizes buyer's mortgage broker, lender, and closing agent to disclose such statuses and progress and release preliminary and finally executed closing disclosures and settlement statements as appropriate and allowed by seller and broker. So in this contract, it states that the title company and lender must work with us to provide us the documentation, the information needed for us to be able to help our customers. If within the loan approval period, so right now in this contract, it's 30 days, buyer obtains loan approval, buyer shall notify seller of same in writing prior, which is an email, to expiration date of the loan approval period. Or if buyer is unable to obtain the loan approval within loan approval period, but buyer is satisfied with the buyer's ability to obtain that loan approval and proceed to closing, buyer shall deliver written notice to seller confirming same prior to the expiration of the loan approval period. You want to make sure if you're a buyer's agent that you inform the listing agent and the seller before that 30th day. You don't have to do it prior to 30th day. You can do it on that 30th day or whatever loan approval time period you agreed upon. Then at that point, you want to make sure that you are sending a written email to the listing agent stating that that buyer is going forward with the loan or is releasing from this contract because they cannot obtain the loan, and you send a release and cancellation at that point. So that ends, the last day of that loan approval is incredibly crucial, and you'll see why in a second. If buyer is unable to obtain loan approval within the loan approval period or cannot timely meet the terms of the loan approval after the exercise of good faith and diligent effort, buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice of termination to seller prior to expiration of the loan approval period. Whereupon, provided buyer is not in default under the terms of these contracts, buyer shall be refunded the deposit. If the buyer, for whatever reason, decides they want to back out, they can do so within that loan approval period. You do not need to provide a denial letter to the listing agent, even if they ask for it. Even if they scream at you, you do not need to provide a denial letter. It is not needed at all in this contract. Just an email, release and cancellation. Buyer cannot obtain a loan. We are backing out of the contract. Please sign to release the deposit. The only time that you may have a hiccup is if the buyer defaults on any one of these contingencies on this contract. So make sure that the buyer doesn't default on that, and then you'll have a smoother time frame of trying to get that contract back. Now, when do you get your broker involved if the seller decides that they're not going to sign the release and cancellation, and all of a sudden you have an escrow dispute? So typically what happens is that you kind of wait about 7 days. The seller's going to want to seek legal counsel. It's going to take a little bit of time for them to do so. Usually in about 7 days, in my experience, that gives the seller enough time to realize that, okay, the attorney's telling me to give the money back because this is just, a pissing match and I'm not going to get anywhere with this. I'm going to sign the release and cancellation and get it back. 9 times out of 10, the 6th or 7th day, the release and cancellation will come back to you. If not, at that point, that's when you get me involved. I will call the broker and we'll see what we can do. Unfortunately, when it comes to escrow disputes, we really don't have that much leeway because these contracts are built for attorneys to be able to fight for escrow on their behalf. So that's when we tell you to tell the customer to provide or seek legal counsel. Okay, if the buyer fails to timely deliver any written notice provided in paragraph 8B3 or 4 above to seller prior to the expiration date of the loan approval period, then the buyer shall proceed forward with this contract as though it is paragraph A. So in the event that you guys as buyer's agents do not provide any written notice, now this contract changes from a financing contract to a cash contract. No more contingencies are there for that buyer to protect their deposit. It goes to a cash contract which does not mean they have to bring cash to closing. What it does mean is that their escrow is now on the line. On top of that, what happens if the seller has a backup offer in the wings? Okay, so you don't provide that notice whether the buyer is going to back out or is going forward. Then at this point, this seller actually has 3 days after the expiration date of the loan approval period to actually cancel this contract, give the deposit back to their buyer, and sign a new contract stating that they're going to maybe accept a higher offer. So there is if you're a buyer's agent, there is a pesky 3-day time frame, only 3 days though, for that seller to be able to back out and maybe take another offer at that point. So that's why the loan approval deadline date is very important for you to notify that listing agent what's going forward, because if you tell the seller that they're going forward, they're not allowed to execute those 3 days. They're not allowed to use those termination dates. At that point, the buyer is going to be going forward with that contract, and within that time frame of loan approval to close, there is an escrow risk at that point. So you have to really seriously make sure on that loan approval deadline, do you really think that buyer can get that loan? If you don't think so, try to extend the loan approval time frame. You want to make sure that if you are extending any closing dates and you're within the loan approval time frame, extend that out as well, so you're protecting your buyer. Okay, so if buyer has timely provided either written notice provided in paragraph 8B or above, and buyer thereafter fails to close, this is the time frame that the deposit's at risk after loan approval. The deposit shall be paid to the seller unless failure to close is due by. Okay, so at this point, you go to closing, and the buyer just decides they don't want the property or they don't like something thereof, then their escrow's at risk and they're in default of this contract. So unless for 1 and 2, so sections 1 and 2 here, it says that the seller's default or inability to satisfy other contingencies of this contract. What if there's liens on this property? What if there are permits on this property and you put a permit clause in there that the seller needs to close out those before closing? These are property related conditions. And you can't get financing because the roof is over the age of 25 years old. Citizens isn't going to approve loans or with roofs that are over the age of 25 years old. So the buyer won't be able to get a loan because they're not going to be able to get insurance, and it just becomes a nightmare. So that's a property related condition. In the event that you go after loan approval and you still haven't buttoned up the insurance yet, and you're getting ready to go to closing, and insurance finally says, I'm not going to actually provide insurance on this property now because this roof is too old or something thereof, then that buyer has the right to get their deposit back. The other one is, like I just said, property related conditions. So you have 2. You have the seller's inability to satisfy other contingencies of this contract, so liens, etc., and property related conditions. So those are the 2 reasons after loan approval that you can back that buyer out of that contract. So just note that. That is pretty much, and when it comes to it, disclose. We are having a lot of problems with insurance on condos right now. So make sure if you are a listing agent to do some serious due diligence on condos, buildings insurance. Do they have enough reserves? Have they done their 40, 50-year inspections? Have they done, the reserve studies? All this other stuff that needs to be taken place in order for it not to be property related conditions. Closing costs, title insurance, surveys, home warranties, and special assessments. So this section here talks about who's going to pay for what. Okay. Costs to be paid by the seller. Documentary stamps, taxes, and surtax deeds, always paid by the seller. Then you've got some down below that are interchangeable. So you're going to see the owner's policy and charges if paragraph 9CI is checked, title search and charges if paragraph 9C3 is checked, or municipal lien search if 9C1 or 9C3 is checked. It says the same thing down here for the buyer's costs. There are hard fees in here that will be paid by the seller and hard fees that will be paid by the buyer. HOA condominium estoppel fees, recording fees, seller's attorney's fees. And for buyer, loan expenses, appraisal fees, buyer's inspection fees. It all explains it all in here. The one thing that is in here, it says FERPTA charges is now been added to this contract as well. And also there are contingencies in here for as-is maintenance requirements. So we're going to go into that below, but what as-is maintenance requirements are. What happens if that seller doesn't do them? So lawn, etc. needs to be maintained. And if they don't do it, you go through your walkthrough with your buyer and your lawn is a foot tall, then it might cost to have a landscaper come out there, or the pool's green and it might cost a pool guy to come out. It might cost $1,000 for all of this. Well, this contract adds a provision in here that the seller agrees to put 125% of estimated costs to meet the as-is maintenance requirements. Well, how are you going to get those estimated costs at the day of closing? So if you have an inkling that you think that these things are happening, I would request to have your walkthroughs done a day prior to closing. So foreclosed properties, short sale properties, divorce property, people are getting divorced, any kind of properties where there's been kind of a little bit of turmoil between the buyer and the seller, ask for that walkthrough the day prior, just to kind of see what's going on with that property, so that you can actually get estimates from licensees to make sure that you know what those costs are going to be to put that money into escrow. Okay, so title evidence. So title evidence, if you are paying cash, or if you're financing, go start off this. If you're financing, the title company must provide a title evidence, title commitment within 15 days from the effective date. If it's a cash transaction, they must provide it at least 5 days prior to closing. So make sure that your buyer is receiving this title commitment. It's imperative that you guys review that, or the title company reviews it with the buyer to make sure that it is a clean title commitment. So there's time frames for that. And it says here that the seller shall furnish a copy to the buyer and the closing agent within 5 days after effective date. The owner's title policy, premium, title search, and closing services, which is a collectively called owner's policy and charges, shall be paid at set forth below. So let's go into it. So now we've got all these boxes on. Which one are we choosing between each other? These 3 boxes down below are going to state who's paying for what. So the first one, it says the seller shall designate the closing agent and pay for the owner's policy and charges, and buyer shall pay the premium for buyer's lender policy and charges for closing services related to the lender's policy. The next one is the buyer is going to pay for designate the closing agent and pay for the owner's policy and charges for closing services. Then you've got the third box. The third box, now we're going to split some fees up a little bit. So even though this is called the Miami-Dade and Broward Regional Provision, it doesn't mean that this you can only use this provision for Miami-Dade and Broward. You can use this for all over the state of Florida. So what does it mean? This buyer's going to designate the closing agent. The seller is going to furnish a copy of the prior owner's policy of title insurance and other evidence of title and fees paid for. And they're also going to pay for a continuation or update of the title evidence, which is acceptable to the buyer's title insurance underwriter. They're also going to pay for the tax search and a municipal lien search. And the buyer will obtain and pay for closing, continuation, and premium of buyer's owner's policy if applicable. Also the buyer's lender's policy. The seller shall not be obligated to pay more than $200 for the abstract continuation or title search ordered and performed by the closing agent. So usually they're not more than $200 anyways. That's kind of why it's already pre-built into the contract. The tax search, municipal lien search, that's roughly around $400, $200 per each. So as you can see, there's splitting of the costs. which is really good. For maybe a buyer that doesn't necessarily have so much money to go to closing, this is a great provision. Also, like say for example, the property's in Palm Beach, and traditionally the seller is going to designate your listing agent, and you're like, well, I'm going to save my seller a few bucks. So we're actually going to pick the Miami-Dade provision, and I'm going to put some of the responsibility on the buyer to choose some things. So, and pay for a couple of things. So that's what this means. And it collectively all kind of adds up into here so that you can kind of show the buyer and the seller what their expenses are. Survey. Okay, so at least 5 days prior to closing date, buyer may, at buyer's expense, have a real property surveyed and surveyed by a registered Florida survey. If seller has a survey covering that property, then they should furnish it to the buyer within 5 days of the effective date. You should always ask to see if a survey was already completed. If you have a cash buyer, for the love of God, please try everything that you can do to get them to do a survey. I'm going to give you a prime example. When I was a brand new agent, I sold a property and begged a buyer. It was a $20,000 little lot. It was 2008 when I got my license, and it was foreclosure world. This guy decided he wanted to buy a vacant land and didn't want to pay for a survey for $500 because it was cheap. I begged him to do it. I even had the title company even furnish it, and if he wanted to have it at closing, he could have just paid for it and added it in there. He still refused. He did not know the four corners of his property. So when we looked at the property was fenced in, not knowing that the owner of the property, it was actually 3 lots, okay? And he only bought the middle lot. The middle lot had a tree on it. That tree allegedly had poisonous fruit on it, and allegedly a neighbor's daughter died because of that tree. At any rate, that's here, there, nor there, but it was a horrible situation. But that buyer never understood that he only bought the sliver in between all of the lots. And it was just a little bit of a nightmare. So you can use this story to protect your buyers in the future of not having a survey. It's incredibly important to have a survey done. If you're financing, a survey is just going to be a part of it anyways. But if it's cash, and really seriously have your buyer try to get a survey done. Home warranty. So at closing, the buyer, seller, or not applicable shall pay for a home warranty plan issued by a home warranty company, not to exceed blank dollars. If you have a first-time home buyer going in to purchase a property and maybe the appliances aren't quite brand new, you could try to negotiate for a seller to do a 1-year home warranty plan. Cinch is the one that we have partnered with here, so if you go into the sphere, you'll see them. Maybe you could try to negotiate something for the buyer to be able to call this company after the fact to do repairs on a refrigerator or something, so that they only have to pay, I don't know, $75 for the person to come out, and then everything else is kind of covered on that warranty. Home warranties are really not traditional in Florida, but I highly recommend them, especially for certain circumstances like that. Special assessments. The first thing that I want to say about special assessments is highlighted. Well, I didn't highlight it, but it's right here. This section does not apply to condominium or homeowners association assessments. You need to have the addendums for that, okay? So it says here, seller shall pay the full amount of the liens imposed by a public body. So the public body is like municipal lien search, municipal water, sewer, stuff like that. So it says the full amount of liens imposed by a public body that are certified, confirmed, and ratified before closing. The amount of public body's most recent estimate or assessment for improvements which are substantially complete as of the effective date, but has not been resulted in a lien, may be imposed on the property. So also that could be city lights. So maybe you guys are, the city's putting some lights in on that street. These are special assessments that you will see in the tax records. There could be an assessment for maybe the fire department to get some upgrades or something like that. So typically you put for something like this, the seller shall pay installments up until closing, the buyer will pay after closing. You can put seller shall pay in full prior to closing. However, in the event that it's a public body that doesn't allow for them to be paid in full, I mean, these could be $50, $60, $100,000 assessments that'll be paid over a 50-year period. You're not going to have your seller pay for something like that. And most public bodies will say, no, we're not allowing that. It's just over an increment period of time built into their taxes or something. Then it will be basically as option A is deemed. This also does not apply to CDD properties, which are Community Development District properties. These are properties that you put in a brand new community and maybe they don't necessarily have enough money to put the recreation area in there, or they want to put, some kind of nice thing in the middle of the community. They can actually take a loan out from the city to do all of that, and it gets imposed into the homeowner's taxes. So, for example, if you're in Pompano Beach, there's a property called Orchid Grove here that taxes should technically be somewhere around the amount of $3,000-$4,000, and they're in the upwards of $7,000 because of this CDD that has been attached to the property for 15 some odd years on there. So this does not apply to that. That is automatically added into the taxes. You can't get the seller to pay for that unless you either get, a reduction in price or a credit at closing. You can't just select this and then they just take it and pay that off. There are some instances where a buyer can or a seller can pay it off, so ask. But that's going to be done in an addendum or something thereof. Okay, so now you've got your disclosures: radon, gas, permit disclosures, mold, flood zones. The biggest one I'm going to pull out of here is the permit disclosures. Okay, sellers must disclose whether they have done any work on that property without a permit. The contract states it. Make sure you understand, if you are a listing agent, that you should be asking the seller, was this kitchen done without a permit? Was this light bulb put in without a permit? Was this fence put in without a permit? Because it must be disclosed. Okay, so here it's saying that the seller doesn't know of any improvements made to the property which were made without required permits, or made pursuant to permits which have not been properly closed out or otherwise disposed. So if the seller identifies permits which have not been closed or improvements which are not permitted, then the seller shall promptly deliver to the buyer all plans, written documents, and other information in seller's possession, knowledge, or control relating to the improvements to which the property is subject of such open permits or unpermitted improvements. Okay. So if we go one step further when it comes to permits, which we will, it's going to show that the seller really doesn't have to do anything to close out those permits. So we need to make sure we have a clause in there to protect our buyers, to enforce the seller to close out their own permits. You don't want the buyer doing it. It's crazy. So we won't really go into flood and elevation certifications, but they are there. It gives a time frame. The only thing that I will say is if the property is in a Fish and Wildlife area or Coastal Barrier Resource Act area, that basically means that it's probably a condo like right on the ocean or the water, and it's in some type of a flood zone, that you need to make sure that that buyer can actually get insurance and flood insurance on that property. So the contract has a built-in 20 days here, but I would highly recommend you mirror and match that to the loan approval timeframe. So you want to make sure that you get that insurance, everything bound as best you can within that loan approval timeframe, or even try to get this date all the way out until the closing date as well, so that the buyer has the right to be able to get their deposit back if they can't get an elevation certificate or insurance for the property or something like that because of the coastal barrier issues. Did you know, by law, you must provide an energy brochure and a lead-based pamphlet at the time of you executing this contract, or even prior to closing. You just must do it. So save those two documents on your desktop and make it a priority to make sure that the buyer receives those documents. Homeowners Association community disclosure. Buyers should not execute this contract until buyer has received and read the Homeowners Association disclosure. The only thing that I'm going to say about that is make sure that the HOA addendum, which has the disclosure on it, is part of your contract when presenting the offer. When it comes to homeowners associations, it's not like condo associations where you require or request the documents have to be provided. You want to make sure that you're asking for those documents because technically the seller doesn't have to provide them to you for homeowners associations. So financial documents, articles of incorporations, bylaws, rules and regulations, make that a part of your contract in additional terms. Property tax disclosure summary. So this is important. The buyer should not rely on the seller's current property taxes as the amount of the property taxes that the buyer may be obligated to pay in the year subsequent to the purchase. A change of ownership or property improvement triggers reassessment of that property that could result in higher property taxes. So, I'll give you a prime example. You have a seller that lived in that property for 30 years. Their taxes, the property's homesteaded. The taxes, I guarantee you, are probably only like $1,000. They're super cheap. If it's a waterfront home and you're paying $3 million for that property, you're going to the buyer's going to end up being reassessed based off the purchase price of that property and homes in the area, and the taxes are going to considerably go up in price. So you should be pointing them to the direction of your county's property appraiser's website. A lot of them have calculators in there so that they can put in their homestead exemptions and etc. to kind of see what their taxes will be for that property. So even though the seller's lived in it for 30 years, that's going to be amazing for that buyer to be able to get that loan because they're going to have more buying power. But when they go to get reassessed after buying it, it's a little bit of a sticker shock for them. So make sure they're reviewing the county's or the property appraiser's website. Built into this contract is FERPTA. You do not need a FERPTA addendum for this contract. If you are using the CRISP contract, there's an addendum for it. If you have an addendum, it's not for this contract. All the language is already built in here. So I see a lot of times where there's a FERPTA addendum attached to it. You don't need it. So here it says that the seller shall inform the buyer in writing if seller is a foreign person. So as defined by a foreign investment. FERPTA, buyer and seller shall comply with FERPTA, which may require the seller to provide additional cash at closing. So if the property is over $300,000, they're probably going to have to withhold about 15%, so that it goes to the IRS, so it's paid to protect for capital gains, etc. And the buyer doesn't get roped into having to pay that. There's a liability to FERPTA on a buyer. If that title company does not collect those funds and the seller goes back to whatever country they're in and IRS doesn't get their money, guess who's paying for it? The buyer. So the buyer will be very upset if this is a $3 million property and it's FERPTA and all of a sudden, they got to pay 15% of what the seller should have paid. You want to make sure you're using a really good attorney to do the closings to make sure that money is withheld. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about FERPTA because I could go on forever about it. Seller's disclosure. We all know in the state of Florida, seller's disclosures are not mandatory. However, this contract does state that the seller knows of no material facts affecting the value of the property. They're disclosing this information to you right here, that have not been disclosed to the buyer. So, except as provided for in the preceding sentence, seller extends and intends no warranty and makes no representation of any type, either expressed or implied, as to the physical condition or history of this property. Except as otherwise disclosed in writing, seller has received no written or verbal notice from any governmental entity or agency as to the currently uncorrected building, environmental, or safety codes. Okay, so the seller's saying they're disclosing no material facts, but also the seller, extends and intends no warranty and makes no representation of any type. So my opinion as your broker is to try your hardest to get a seller's disclosure. It not only will disclose information to your seller, but it really is a CYA, cover your ass situation for you as well. In some cases, errors and omissions, if you do not have a seller's disclosure, E&O will not kick in for you. You will not get E&O to protect you in any kind of situations without a seller's disclosure. So it is highly recommended, because E&O here is at the broker level. If you want to go and get your own E&O, we recommend it. And if you're shopping around, ask that question: is E&O voidable if I do not get a seller's disclosure? It's very important for you to know that. And it's very important for you to try to get that information for your buyer as well, to disclose this type of information. Property maintenance. So this is where we talked about up at the top, where you can put 125% into escrow at the time of closing if they have not done their maintenance or their as-is maintenance requirements. So it says it's not limited to, but it's lawn, shrubbery, and pool condition existing as of the effective date. So as of the effective date, you present an offer, and the lawn is really beautiful, the shrubbery is really beautiful, and the pool is crystal blue. You go to closing, the lawn's a foot tall, the pool's green, and the shrubbery's all over the place. You are allowed to state to the title company that this has not been maintained. My landscaper says it's going to cost me, I don't know, $1,000 in the pool, $1,000 combined. Excuse me. The title company will say, all right, we're going to escrow the funds of 125%. The buyer doesn't get all that 125% if by chance it's maybe you put in $1,500 and it's only $1,000, the seller will get back to $500. Okay, so inspections. Buyer shall have X amount of days for an inspection. If the buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion that the property is not acceptable to the buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice of such election to seller prior to the expiration date of the inspection period. If buyer timely terminates this contract, the deposit shall be paid back to the buyer. Here's where the issue lies. If in the event that you go past the 10-day inspection period, there's a little highlighted provision down here that says, unless the buyer exercises the right to terminate granted herein, buyer accepts the physical condition of the property and any violation of governmental, building, environmental, and safety codes, restrictions, or requirements, but not subject to sellers continuing as is maintenance. They still have to do that. And buyer shall be responsible for any and all repairs and improvements required by buyer's lender. Yikes! What does that all mean? Well, the buyer has their due diligence period of 10 days. Shortening it any less than that hinders the buyer, because what happens if there's a permit on that property, or the lien search comes back with something that the buyer's not willing to take on? Well, if you go past those inspection periods, the buyer's taking that stuff on after the fact. So we have a built-in clause or an added clause that you can add into the contract so that you can protect the buyer, so that in the duration of the whole contract that something happens, we're putting the onus back on the seller to actually close this out. Remember, this is an as-is contract, which kind of really gives the seller a lot of leeway, and not so much the buyer. So it's really important that you have this clause in here, which I will give to you towards the end, that will protect the buyer from not having to worry about any of this and putting the onus back on the seller to close this out or correct these issues prior to closing. Okay? Walkthrough inspection. On the day prior to closing, or on closing date prior to the time of closing, as specified by the buyer or buyer's representative may perform a walkthrough and a follow-up walkthrough if necessary. So the as-is maintenance requirements, you do a walkthrough the day prior to, and everything is a mess, and the seller says, okay, I'm going to repair that prior to closing. You are allotted another walkthrough prior to the closing so that you make sure that that stuff is taken care of. Okay? Seller's as-is, seller's assistance in cooperating and closeout of building permits. If buyer's inspection of the property identifies open or needed building permits, then seller shall promptly deliver to buyer all plans, written documents, and other information in seller's possession, knowledge, or control relating to the improvements of the property. A little redundant here, because it said the same thing up above, but it says which are subject to open or needed permits and shall promptly cooperate in good faith with buyer's efforts to obtain estimates or repairs or other work necessary to resolve the permit issues. It says seller's obligation to cooperate shall include seller's execution of necessary authorizations, consents, and other documents necessary for buyer to conduct inspections. However, the seller shall not be required to expend or become obligated to expend any money. So maybe they do a whole kitchen without permits, and now the buyer needs to get permits on this property, and permits after the fact are much more expensive than getting permits before you do the work, which means now the buyer is going to have to pay for probably double the cost of permit fees in order for them to obtain permits, get an inspection done, and make sure everything's okay, and then have that work signed off on and closed out at the city. All that responsibility is on the buyer. Buyer doesn't even own this property yet, and we're already putting responsibility on him to do all this? Absolutely not. So we're gonna put a clause in here to protect your buyer for that. I will say, on the seller side, if you do not put the clause on an addendum, not an addendum, I'm sorry, a clause into the additional terms for this, then the seller gets away scot-free, and the buyer will have the obligation to close on that property, okay? And they might not want to, and if they don't, they would be in breach of contract. So, again, buyers, agents, put this clause in there. All right, assignment of repairs and treatments of contracts and warranties. At buyer's option and cost, seller will, at closing, assign all assignable repair, treatments, maintenance. So all of the assignments are at the buyer's cost, not the seller's cost. So know that as well. Escrow agent. The only thing that I'm really going to point out here that's the most important is that if there's an escrow dispute on here, that the agent, the escrow closing agent, the escrow company, has the option to continue to hold the subject matter of escrow until the parties agree to its disbursement. The only way that a title company is allowed to disperse monies back to a buyer or allot it to a seller is with a release and cancellation signed by both parties, as well as or a final judgment from the courts. So now you can't get a release and cancellation signed and both buyer and seller retain an attorney, they go to court, there's going to be a final judgment. You're going to need that document, the title company is going to need that document in order to send the funds to the winning party. If the title company doesn't even want to do any of that, the agent may deposit the money with the clerk of the circuit court having jurisdiction over the dispute. So they can actually send it to the county and they can hold it in the clerk of courts. And the buyer and the seller will have to work with the clerk of courts at that point because the title company is saying, nope, I'm not wanting anything to do with this. I am just going to send the money. It does cost the title company money to do so. So whoever, during that case, whatever money it is, so say it's $10,000, whoever's awarded that money, the money that the title company incurs will actually get paid back first. So say it's $500 to send the money to the clerk of courts. Then $500 is going to come from that $10,000, and then the rest of the money will be split accordingly. So that's all I'm going to say about that. Professional advice and broker liability. Okay, so broker advises buyer and seller to verify property condition, square footage, and all other facts and representations made pursuant to the contract, and to consult appropriate professionals for legal, tax, environmental, and any other specialized advice concerning matters affecting the property and the transaction. So, you guys, all of this here is out of the scope of your profession. You're not tax professionals unless you're actually licensed. You're not environmental folks. You're not attorneys. You are not allowed to interpret any of this contract to a buyer or seller. If in the event that you do a basic explanation to them and they don't understand it, you should tell them to seek legal counsel. Okay? And this in big, bold letters here, all in capitals, it says that the buyer agrees to rely solely on the seller professional inspectors, and governmental agencies for verification of property condition, square footage, and facts that materially affect a property in value. If I was a buyer's agent, which I have done for several years, I point this out to my buyer. I am not a professional in any of this. This is not in in my scope of my profession. I will provide you the contact information to these professionals so that you can reach out and get the information that you need. I cannot provide this information. The moment that you, as a real estate agent, start talking about legal, start talking about tax, your license is on the line. So just don't do it. Okay? And then this just talks about holding the broker, liable for, indemnifies all of us for all that stuff. I have seen some people cross that out because they don't want to indemnify the broker. If that happens, it's fine. We don't like it, but sometimes you'll see attorneys just cross some of this stuff out. Says here that the buyer and seller each assume full responsibility for selecting and compensating their respective vendors and paying their other costs under the contract. I wanted to point that out there because sometimes you'll have a buyer that will start working with a title company, an inspection company, and they might not pay them. This contract states and basically has it in here stating that both of them are responsible for paying their own fees. Maybe a lien search was done and that's like $200 and it doesn't go to closing, the title company is going to seek to get reimbursed. Some of them will, some of them don't. Buyer defaults. Actually, I want to point this out as well. It says here, for purposes of this paragraph that's above here, broker will be treated as a party to this contract. This is the only section that we are a party to this contract for. We are not a party to anything else of this contract. That's why, which I'll talk about a little bit below, commissions do not belong on contracts or addendums. Okay, so buyer default. If buyer fails, neglects, or refuses to perform buyer's obligation under this contract, including payment of deposit within the time specified, seller may elect to recover and retain the deposit for the account of seller. So say you have $5,000 the buyer was supposed to put into the escrow. They didn't. They still kind of went through inspections after the fact and then decided to back out on the 10th day. The buyer's in default. The seller can take them to small claims court or court to retain that $5,000, even if they didn't put that money in escrow. The buyer is in default, so it's very important to let the buyer know, put the money in escrow, otherwise we need to back you out before that deposit's not put in, or extend with an addendum the deposit time frame to have all parties understand that the buyer's going to put it in at a different time frame. So there are some things in here. So it says the seller may elect to recover and retain the deposit for all accounts for the seller as agreed upon liquidated damages in consideration for executing of this contract and in full settlement of any claims, whereupon buyer and seller shall be relieved from all further obligations under this contract. Okay, so the seller default. If for any reason other than failure of seller to make seller's title marketable after reasonable diligent effort, seller fails to neglect or refuses just to perform on this contract obligations, buyer may elect to receive return of the deposit without thereby waiving any action for damages resulting from seller's breach. So they should be able to get their deposit back, and if they want to sue for whatever reason, they're more than welcome to do so. Dispute resolutions. So unresolved controversies, claims, and other matters in question between buyer and seller arising out of or relating to this contract, it says it will be settled as follows. The only time 16A applies, where it says buyer and seller will have 10 days after the date of conflicting demands, a lot of that is that really only applies to if the money's held with a real estate company, where we actually have to get FREC involved and do an escrow EDO, escrow disbursement order, to try to get FREC involved to figure out where the money's going to go. The section B here, 16B, talks about buyer and seller shall attempt to settle disputes amicably by trying to go through a court-appointed mediator first. If that doesn't happen, then you might go into arbitration or litigation, depending. So it does talk a little bit about disputes there as well. attorney's fees and costs. The party will split equally any mediation fees incurred, if any mediation permitted by this contract, and each party will pay their own costs, expenses, and fees, including attorney's fees, incurred by conducting the mediation. In any litigation permitted by this contract, the prevailing party shall be entitled to recover from the non-prevailing party all their costs and fees, including reasonable attorney's fees incurred in conducting the litigation. So this paragraph actually survives after the termination of this contract. Section 16 and 17 survive after that. Now we're going to go into the standards. We talked about some standards up above in regards to when there are leases involved with a purchase and so forth. So standard A talks about title. So title, evidence, restrictions, easements, and limitations. When the time period provided in 9C for the title commitment, which is either 15 days or 5 days, 5 days for cash, 15 for financing, with legible copies of instruments listed as exceptions attached to the title commitment, shall be issued and delivered to the buyer. The title commitment shall set forth those matters to be discharged by seller at or before the closing, and shall provide that upon recording of the deed to buyer, an owner's policy of title insurance in the amount of the purchase price, so title insurance is in the purchase price, shall be issued to the buyer, ensuring buyer's marketable title to the real property. Okay, subject only to the following matters. So there could be some restrictions for a couple things. One, or A, comprehensive land use plan, zoning, and other land use restrictions, prohibitions or requirements imposed by government authorities. B, restrictions in matters appearing on the plot or otherwise common to the subdivision. Outstanding oil, gas, mineral rights of records without right of entry. Unplatted public utility easements of record located contiguous to the real property lines are not more than 10 feet in width as to the rear of the front lines. Taxes for year of closing and subsequent years. So if the taxes were not paid, they need to be paid. And F, assumed mortgages and purchase money mortgages. So these are all can be considered as exceptions on a title commitment. So you will see here the contract basically spells out what these are. Now it says here that assumed mortgages and money mortgages, if applicable, provided that none prevent use of property for residential purposes. If there exists at closing any violations of items from B to F above, then the same shall be deemed as a title defect. Marketable title shall be determined according to applicable title standards adopted by the authority of the Florida Bar and in accordance with law. This is really important. If there's a lien on the property and the title company says it, look at the title commitment and see if any of these are on here. There are provisions that we're going to go over that state what happens with this contract, that if the title company can't get these closed out, or the seller can't get something like this closed out prior to closing, what happens? So let's dive into that. So section 2 of A is title examination. The buyer shall have 5 days after receipt of the title commitment to examine it and notify seller in writing specifying the defects, if any, that render the title unmarketable. If the seller provides the title commitment and it is delivered to the buyer less than 5 days prior to closing date, the buyer may extend this contract for up to 5 days after the receipt of examination. Same in accordance with the standard A. Okay, so the buyer gets it, the finance buyer gets it within 15 days. They have 5 days to be able to review it. Within that 5 days, they must, in writing, acknowledge or inform the seller that there are that the title is unmarketable. When you do that in writing to them, the seller shall have 30 days, which is called a cure period, after receipt of the buyer's notice to take reasonable, diligent efforts to remove the defects. If the buyer fails to do so, to notify the seller, the buyer shall be deemed to have accepted the title as it is right then and there. So notifying the seller within those 5 days is crucial if you want to extend this contract out to try to get the seller to close this stuff out. So if seller cures defects within cure period, the seller will deliver written notice to the buyer with proof of cure acceptable to buyer and buyer's attorney, and the parties will close this contract on the closing date. Or if the closing date has passed within 10 days after buyer's receipt of seller's notice, then the property will go to closing. If the seller is unable to cure the defects within the cure period, 30 days, then buyer may, within 5 days after expiration of the cure period, so you have their 30 days here, you have day 31 to 35 after the expiration to deliver written notice to the seller doing one of the three things. A, extending cure period for a specific period of time not to exceed 120 days, within seller shall continue to use reasonable diligent effort to remove the cure. Or electing to accept the title with existing defects and close this contract within 10 days of clearing of it. Or C, electing to terminate this contract and receive a refund of the deposit, thereby releasing the buyer and seller. So if there are liens on the property, this contract has provisions that the buyer can implement the cure period so that the seller can start that cure period to go to closing. If this is done, then you can do it in writing. In writing can be an email stating we're going to implement these provisions, so 30 days or 90 days or whatever after the 30th day. You don't need to do it with an addendum. You could do it in writing with an email. Survey. If survey discloses encroachments of the real property or other improvements located therein, an encroachment on setback lines, easements, or lands, and other or violate any restrictions, covenants, and applicable to government regulations, the buyer shall deliver written notice to such matters, together with a copy of the survey, to seller within 5 days after buyer's receipt of the survey, but no later than closing. So if buyer timely delivers such notice and survey to seller, such matters identified in the notice, the survey shall constitute a title defect, subject to cure obligations of standard A above, which we just went over the cure period. If seller has delivered a prior survey, seller shall, at buyer's request, execute an affidavit of no charge to the real property, since the preparation of such prior survey, to the extent the affirmations therein are true and correct. So it's up to the buyer if they want to get a second survey done after receiving the first survey, just in case there may have been some changes to the property. A fence might have been put in unpermitted. You don't necessarily know where the lines are, all that stuff. So that's the survey section. Ingress and egress. Seller represents that there is ingress and egress to the property. Means that the structure or the building that is on the land, which is normally the house, has basically a driveway or an access road where the buyer can get, or the owner can get in and out of that property. There are properties in Florida that don't have ingress egress and have had to use other people's portions of land to be able to get out of their property. So we won't go into that, but there are things where if it's done for over a year period of time, then the owner of the property next door actually kind of loses a little bit of the rights of that property, because that buyer now uses it as ingress and egress for that they will end up having those rights. So lease information. Now we're going back to the leases, standard D, where if a tenant is going to stay in after closing, it says here that the seller shall, at least 10 days prior to closing, furnish to buyer estoppel letters from the tenant's occupants specifying nature and duration of occupancy. It also will state rental rates, advanced rent, and security deposits paid by the tenant or occupants, which are considered an estoppel letter. If seller is unable to obtain such estoppel letters, the same information shall be furnished by a seller to the buyer within the time period in the form of a seller's affidavit. So if they can't get estoppel letters from the tenants, then the seller is actually going to provide seller's affidavits to the information stating that everything is true in fact. If estoppel letters or seller's affidavits, if any, differ materially from seller's representations and leases provided pursuant to paragraph 6. So paragraph 6 talked about getting the leases. Now standard D is talking about the timeframes for estoppels and seller's affidavits. So the buyer may deliver written notice to the seller within 5 days after receipt of such information, but no later than 5 days prior to closing, terminating this contract, and receive a refund of deposit. So they should get this information as soon as possible. They'll have 5 days to review it, but say they get it 5 days prior to closing, they will not be able to have that time to review it. They'll just end up going to closing because there is a 5-day protection period for the seller in here that that does not allow the buyer to exercise the right to be able to back out. Liens. Seller shall furnish to buyer at closing an affidavit attesting to the absence of any financing statements, claims of lien, or potential lieners known to seller, that there have been no improvements or repairs to the property for 90 days immediately preceding the closing date. If the real property has been improved or repaired within that time, seller shall deliver releases or waivers of construction liens executed by all general contractors, subcontractors, suppliers and materials. So sometimes in condos, you'll actually see that there is a condo that has done some work. You might have to get what's called a sufficient affidavit, stating that the condo building has actually got enough reserves in order to pay the liens that the companies are putting on them. So they're called contractors' liens on the construction of the work. So there are ways to get around it. Some title companies will allow it, some will not. So it's a case-by-case situation. Time for acceptance is calendar days. So based on where the property is located, this shall be used in computing time periods. Other than for, on the first page, the time for acceptance, for the effective date set paragraph in paragraph 3, any time periods provided for or dates specified on this contract, whether pre-printed, handwritten, typewritten, or inserted, shall end or occur on a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal holiday. It will automatically get extended to the next business day. So I'll give you an example. Escrow. If you execute a contract on a Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday, then your escrow is going to be due on the following Monday. If Monday is a holiday, then escrow will be due on the Tuesday. The same thing happens if an inspection period, you get a 10-day inspection period on that 10th day ends on a Saturday or Sunday, then it will get extended to Monday. If Monday is a national legal holiday, it will get extended to 11:59 p.m. on Tuesday. So that's how time periods will shift if they fall on a Saturday, Sunday, or national holiday. The only thing that does not is the effective date of the contracts or the closing date. Those are hard dates. Okay, force majeure. Force majeures are things like hurricanes, floods, extreme weather, earthquakes, fires, or other acts of God, unusual transportations, wars, insurrections, civil unrest, or acts of terrorism, governmental actions and mandates, governmental shutdowns, epidemics, and pandemics have now been put in there, which by exercise of reasonable diligent effort and non-performing party is unable to, in whole or in part, to prevent, to overcome. No one can stop a hurricane. So, for example, insurance, when you are in the cone, you cannot bind insurance. That is considered something that would be like a force majeure, which may possibly have to extend the contract. Hurricanes, if one blows through Florida and you have to wait for the title company to be able to, get back into business, the insurance company to get back into business, the lender being able to get back to lending, all of this kind of stuff is considered force majeure. There's a time frame that actually will extend for up to 7 days. Old contracts used to say 14. We've now shortened it to 7 days after force majeure event no longer prevents performance. So in the event that force majeure, a hurricane maybe damaged the property considerably, and the seller's working on trying to get it repaired. The seller actually will be allotted 30 days beyond the closing date um, to try to get that work completed. In the event that they can't get it done, then either party may terminate the contract and the buyer will be able to get their deposit back. So there are some protections in regards to force majeure for that. Seller shall convey the property, convey marketable title to the real property by statutory warranties, trustees, personal representatives, or guardian deeds as appropriate to the status of seller, subject only to matters described in Standard A, and those accepted to the buyer. Personal property shall at request of buyer be transferred by absolute bill of sale with warranty of title. So this here talks about personal property to be done with a bill of sale, not necessarily done with this contract. Closing will be designated by the party paying for the owner's policy and title insurance. So if the buyer chooses and pays for the owner policy, they're designating. Seller chooses, pays for the owner's policy, they're designating. Third provision is the Miami-Dade one. Means the buyer's choosing and the seller's going to help out with some costs. So this states it here as well that the party paying is the party choosing. Seller shall provide buyer with paid receipts for all work done on the property pursuant to this contract. Buyer shall furnish and pay for, as applicable, the survey, flood elevation certificate, and documents required by buyer's lender. So again, it starts talking about what the buyer's responsible for closing here as well. I won't go into FinCEN and reporting obligations. You don't need to know that really. The deed will be recorded upon collection of all closing funds. If the title commitment provides insurance against adverse matters, as amended, the escrow closing procedures in Standard J will be waived. So closing agent shall be subject to collection of all closing funds, disperse at closing, the brokerage fees to broker, and net sale proceeds to seller. So again, here it's talking about the closing, both parties are allowing the closing agent to actually disperse funds, including the funds to the brokers at the time of closing. So escrow closing procedure. If title commitment issues pursuant to 9C does not provide for insurance against adverse matters, as permitted under Section 627 of Florida statutes, as amended, the following escrow and closing procedures shall apply. So they have pre-written information or rules in here that give to the title company about what they need to do. So one is all closing procedures shall be held. All closing proceeds shall be held in escrow by the closing agent for a period of no more than 10 days after closing. So the title company is not allowed to hold the closing proceeds for anything longer than 10 days after closing. If seller's title is rendered unmarketable through no fault of buyer, buyer shall within 10-day period notify seller in writing of the title defect, and the seller shall have 30 days. So again, it's telling the title company there's a cure period if there are some title issues. It's also telling the title company if the seller fails to timely cure the defect, the deposit and the closing funds will be paid back to the buyer within 5 days after written demand by the buyer and be refunded to the buyer simultaneously with such repayment. And 4, if buyer fails to make timely demand for refund of the deposit, the buyer shall take title as is, waiving all rights against the seller as to any intervening defect, except as may be available to buyer by virtue of warranties contained in the deed or bill of sale. So again, these are just escrow closing procedures. As you can see, they have rules that they need to abide by on this contract as well. Probations and credits. The following reoccurring items will be made current. So it talks about the real estate taxes will be prorated. It also talks about interest, bonds, association fees, insurance, rent, and other expenses of the property. The seller will pay up until the day of closing. The day of closing is the buyer's. So when you're doing prorations, just know that the day of closing is the buyer's, and the buyer will take on The rest from there. It says here taxes shall be prorated based on the current year's taxes. If in the event that the taxes are reassessed and they are more, the buyer actually has a right to go back to the seller and state this is not really what the taxes were, they were actually X, I need more money. So usually the title company will help reach out. Worst case scenario, the buyer is going to need to get an attorney. So it says here, a tax proration based on an estimate shall, at either party's request, be readjusted upon receipt of current year's tax bill. And again, standard K is shall survive at closing. Access to property to conduct appraisals, inspections, and walkthroughs. Seller shall, upon reasonable notice, provide utilities, services, and access to property for appraisals and inspections, including a walkthrough or follow-up walkthrough if necessary prior to closing. So again, it's telling the seller what their obligations are here for that. Risk of loss. If after the effective date, but before closing, property is damaged by fire or other casualty, loss, and cost of restoration, which shall include cost of pruning or removing damaged trees, does not exceed 1.5% of the purchase price. Cost of restoration shall be an obligation of seller, and closing shall proceed pursuant to the terms of the contract. If in the event the restoration is not completed as of closing, a sum equal to 125% of the estimated cost to complete restoration, not to exceed 1.5% of the purchase price, will be escrowed at closing. If actual cost of restoration exceeds escrowed amount, seller shall pay such actual costs, but not to exceed 1.5% of the purchase price. Any unused portion of escrow shall go back to the seller. And if costs of restoration exceed 1.5% of the purchase price, buyer shall elect to either take the property as is, together with the 1.5%, or receive a refund of the deposit, thereby releasing buyer and seller from all further obligations. So 1.5% of a $300,000 property, $4,500. That's the money that they have in order to allot to be able to do repairs. Any money over that, the buyer may be able to be released. We're going too far here. 1031 exchange. So there's a little blip about 1031 exchanges here. If seller or buyer wish to enter into a like-kind exchange, this would be an investment property in this case. You can't do 1031 exchanges if you are a home buyer trying to purchase another home. 1031 exchanges are tax deferring onto the next property that they go to buy, and then taxes would be due when they sell that property unless they do another 1031 exchange. You could do 1031 exchanges until you're blue in the face, until you die, and then it become your kid's problem after they buy the property, after they have to sell the property. But it's a great way for an investor. Hold on 1 second. It's a great way for an investor to be able to use that money that they would after have to pay for capital gains to be able to purchase another property. It gives them more buying power, which is actually beneficial. So if they have a $800,000 property that they're selling and they want to buy $1 million property, and their capital gains are $150,000, for example, just say that, then they could use that money as the buying power to buy that $1 million property. So 1031 exchanges are pretty cool if you can, if you're an investor purchasing property. This contract is not recordable. You cannot record this contract with the county. So notice and delivery given by or to the attorney or broker, including such brokers, real estate licenses representing any party, shall be as effective as the given date or the property. So it basically says that this contract shall not be binding on or inure to the benefit of the parties or their respective heirs. So at that point, that's something that, pardon me, sorry, I got lost there for a second. Somebody was trying to open my door. So it says whenever the context pronoun singular shall include plural and one gender shall include. So it's, and all notices must be in writing. Again, that's more for the title company in regards to recordings and stuff like that. So integration, modification. This contract contains the full and complete understanding and agreement of buyer and seller with respect to the transaction contemplated by this contract, and no prior agreements or representations shall be binding. So this is the only contract that there is. There are no other modifications or anything unless they're attached to this contract. So it says riders and addenda, typewritten or handwritten, they're all part of this contract as well. Anything handwritten in shall prevail over everything that is typewritten in this contract. So collection or collected. Collection or collected means any checks tendered or received, including deposits, have become actually and finally collected and deposited in the account of escrow agent or closing agent. Closing and disbursement of funds and delivery of closing documents may be delayed by closing agent until such amounts have been collected in closing agent's accounts. Okay, so again, this talks more about FERPTA here. So it talks about the responsibilities. They must withhold 15%. It's for national, it gives them some rules on here as well. This talks more about the buyer waiving of claims to the extent permitted by law. Buyer waives any claims against seller and against any real estate licensee involved in the negotiations of this contract, or for any damages or defects pertaining to the physical condition of the property. Again, not in our scope of our business to be an inspector. That may exist at closing of this contract and be subsequently discovered by the buyer or anyone claiming by, through, under, or against this. This provision does not relieve seller's obligation to comply with paragraph 10, which is disclosing all known material facts that could affect the property, and that this standard X shall survive the closing. Addendas. So at the time of your offer using this contract, if you are adding addendums to the contract and you send this contract over with the addendums, you must receive this contract and the addendums back at the exact same time in order for this contract to be effective. Example, you send over this contract, a homeowners association and a lead-based paint addendum, and you get back only the contract and the homeowners association addendum, and then the following day you get the lead-based paint. That following day is your effective date. Okay, so everything has to come back at the exact same time in order for that contract to be effective. So also, if you are using the escalation addendum, you need to make sure that you're attaching it over here. You do have an appraisal contingency here. It's not really needed because this contract now has the appraisal contingency built into the financing contingency, so this isn't really even needed anymore. There are provisions in this contract here that you want to use. Now these are in Form Simplicity, Transaction Desk, all of this language is in there, so you just have to copy and paste it into your contract when you're filling it out. But this puts the onus back on the seller that they need to disclose to the buyer, any kind of open expired permits, they need to close them out, and any repairs that the seller needs to do, they need to do it at their own expense and be made by a licensed workman prior to closing and under appropriate terms. Another couple ones that you might want to use as well, if you do want to add a seller's disclosure to be provided to the buyer, request it within 3 days. And in the event that the seller's disclosure is not provided within this time frame, the buyer may elect to terminate this agreement by providing written notice to the seller, thereby terminating this agreement. So if it's really important for that buyer to get a seller's disclosure, make it part of the contract. When crediting, reducing, waiving commissions, it does not belong on this contract, okay? The contract is between the buyer and seller. Commissions are between brokers. So you need to speak with your support team or me to provide you with a broker commission letter to provide to the title company stating that the broker is allowing a credit, a reduction, or a waiving of commissions to happen. They don't belong on the contract at all. This is where the buyer and seller will execute. If you're going to put, buyer's address for purposes of notice, just put your email address there. Any notice is going to be provided to you anyways, so beforehand, so that's taken care. So also down here, I want to point out where it says broker, listing and cooperating brokers, if any, named below, are the only brokers entitled to compensation in connection with this contract. Instruction to closing agent, seller and buyer direct closing agent to disperse at closing the full amount of the brokerage fees as specified in a separate broker brokerage agreement with the parties and cooperative agreements between the brokers, except to the extent broker has retained such fees from the escrowed funds. That's your escrow dispute here. This contract shall not modify any MLS or other offer of compensation made by seller or listing broker to cooperating brokers. So how does commission work? Commission, when you're a listing agent, you do a contractual agreement between the seller and the listing brokerage. Then the listing brokerage does an agreement in the MLS to state the offer of compensation to the buyer's agent. So that offer of compensation in the MLS will not be changed if you change whatever, the agreement to whatever you put in this contract. Maybe you're going to reduce your commission by 0.5%. You must get the broker to agree to that. Otherwise, there could be a procuring cause situation. So whatever is in the MLS dictates it, unless there's some kind of commission agreement from the listing agent's broker, from the buyer's agent's broker to waive, or basically that's it. So make sure that that's taking place. So this is the as-is contract. I'm going to stop the recording now, and then we're going to go into all your questions that you have.